The evening air carried the scent of dried grass and dust as Sarah McKenna latched the barn door shut. The metal hinges creaked their familiar protest, a sound that had become as much a part of her daily routine as the ache in her shoulders from hauling water buckets. She wiped her hands on her worn apron, feeling the grit of another day's work settle into the creases of her palms. The Wyoming sky stretched endless above her small homestead, painted in shades of amber and rust as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains. She had always found comfort in this hour, when the harsh light of day softened and the world seemed to hold its breath before nightfall. But tonight, something felt different. A sound made her pause with her hand still on the barn door latch. It wasn't the usual settling of wood or the soft nickering of her mare, Copper, from inside the stall. This was something else, a restless shuffling, followed by a sharp snort that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Sarah pressed her ear closer to the weathered wood. Inside, she could hear Copper moving about, but there was another sound too, heavy breathing that didn't belong to her horse, and the scrape of hooves against the dirt floor, urgent, agitated. Her pulse quickened. In the 3 years since her father's death, she had learned to trust her instincts about danger. Living alone on the frontier meant reading signs most folks in civilized places never had to consider. The way a horse held its ears could mean the difference between a peaceful night and finding your livestock scattered to kingdom come by morning. She was reaching for the latch again when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. In the distance, a rider was approaching at a steady pace, not fast enough to suggest emergency, but purposeful. Sarah squinted into the gathering dusk, trying to make out the figure against the darkening horizon. The rider came closer, and she could see it was a man on a dark horse, both moving with the easy rhythm of those accustomed to long distances. He wasn't wearing the clothes of a drifter or a man running from something. His hat sat straight on his head, and even from this distance, she could tell his posture spoke of someone comfortable in the saddle. When he was still a good 50 yards away, he raised his hand in greeting and called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Ma'am, best step away from that barn door." Sarah's hand jerked back from the latch as if it had burned her. The stranger's tone held urgency without panic, the voice of someone who knew trouble when he saw it. "There's a bull in there that ain't yours," he continued as he brought his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. "Been watching him work himself into a lather for the past 10 minutes. He's fixin' to come through that door whether it's open or not." As if summoned by his words, a tremendous crash came from inside the barn, followed by the splintering of wood. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart hammering as she realized what she had nearly walked into. The breathing she'd heard wasn't Copper's distress, it was a bull working himself into a rage. The stranger dismounted with fluid ease, his boots hitting the ground with barely a sound. He was tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of work rather than just size, and moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had handled his share of dangerous situations. "How did you—" Sarah began, but he was already moving toward the barn, pulling something from his saddlebag. "Saw him break through your eastern fence about an hour back," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos coming from behind the barn door. "Been tracking him since. He's been on the trail too long. Got himself worked up something fierce." Another crash shook the barn, and Sarah heard Copper whinny in alarm. The mare was trapped in there with a maddened bull, and every second that passed made the situation more dangerous. "What can we do?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. The stranger had pulled a length of rope from his saddle and was fashioning a loop with practiced movements. "Got to get him calmed down first. When he comes through that door, and he will, we need to be ready." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. and she found herself meeting his gaze directly. His eyes were the color of winter sky, serious but not unkind. There was something in his expression that made her feel less alone than she had in months. "You know how to handle a rope?" he asked. "Well enough," Sarah replied. It wasn't boasting. She had learned to do most things well enough out of necessity. "Good. When he breaks through, I'll get the rope on him, but I'll need you to help guide him away from the barn. Can you do that?" She nodded, and he handed her the end of the rope. His fingers brushed hers briefly as he passed it over, and she noticed they were calloused from years of real work, like her own. The next crash was followed by the sound of wood giving way entirely. The barn door bulged outward, then exploded into fragments as a massive brown bull charged into the fading daylight, his eyes rolling white with rage and confusion. The stranger's rope sailed through the air with perfect accuracy, settling around the bull's neck just as the animal wheeled toward the house. Sarah pulled her end taut, feeling the rope burn against her palms as the bull fought against the restraint. "Easy now," the stranger said, his voice pitched low and soothing. "Easy, boy. Nobody's looking to hurt you." For several long minutes, they worked together in the growing darkness, the stranger gradually approaching the agitated animal while Sarah maintained tension on the rope. She watched in fascination as he moved, never hurried, never aggressive, just persistent and calm until the bull's breathing began to slow and his wild rolling eyes started to focus. When the animal finally stood still, sides heaving but no longer fighting, the stranger looked over at Sarah with something that might have been approval. "You did good," he said simply. "Not many folks would have kept their heads with all that commotion." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at the quiet praise. It had been a long time since anyone had acknowledged her competence with anything more dangerous than churning butter. "Will he be all right?" she asked, looking at the bull, who was now standing docilely as if the past 20 minutes had been someone else's tantrum. "He'll be fine. Just needs to get home and settle down. Probably belongs to the Mitchell spread, about 5 miles north. I'll see him back there tomorrow." The stranger began coiling his rope with the same efficient movements he'd used to throw it. "Your mare's likely shaken up but not hurt. Bulls make a lot of noise, but they don't usually go after horses unless they're truly rabid, and this one's just tired and confused." As if to confirm his words, Copper's familiar nicker drifted from the damaged barn. Sarah felt the last of her tension ease away, replaced by the peculiar emptiness that comes after crisis has passed. "I should check on her," she said, starting toward the barn. "I'll help you get that door situation sorted first," the stranger said. "Won't take but a minute to rig something temporary." She paused, studying his face in the dim light. "I don't even know your name." "Luke Carter," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed automatic rather than calculated. "And you'd be Miss McKenna, unless I miss my guess. Your father was Thomas McKenna." "You knew my father?" "Met him once, couple years back. Traded some horses with him. He spoke of you." Sarah felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. Her father had been gone 3 years now, but hearing that he had mentioned her to a stranger brought back the acute awareness of how alone she was out here. "He was a good man," Luke said quietly. "I was sorry to hear of his passing." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak just then. Luke seemed to understand, because he turned his attention back to the practical matter of the broken barn door. "Got some extra boards in my pack," he said. "We can get this secured for the night, at least." As they worked to patch the damage, Sarah found herself stealing glances at this man who had appeared out of nowhere to help her. Luke Carter worked with the same calm efficiency he'd shown with the bull, his movements economical and sure. He didn't fill the silence with unnecessary talk, but neither did his quiet feel unfriendly. When they finished, the barn door was secure enough to keep Copper safe for the night. Luke gathered his tools and stepped back to survey their work with a critical eye. "That'll hold," he said with satisfaction. "You'll want to get some proper lumber from town when you can, but it'll do for now." "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it more than he could know. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Luke shrugged, but she caught a slight smile at the corners of his mouth. "Right place at the right time. I reckon. Happens sometimes." He moved toward his horse, and Sarah felt a strange reluctance to see him go. It wasn't just gratitude for his help, though that was real enough. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. "Mr. Carter," she called as he swung up into the saddle. "Where are you headed?" "Cheyenne," he said. "Got some freight to deliver. Should make it by tomorrow evening if I start early." Sarah nodded, trying not to let disappointment show on her face. Cheyenne was 2 days' ride from here, which meant he'd be long gone by the time she saw another soul. But Luke was looking up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Might be we're in for some weather tonight," he said thoughtfully. "Sky's got that look to it." She followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The clear evening was giving way to a bank of clouds moving in from the west, obscuring the stars one by one. "You're welcome to shelter in the barn," she found herself saying. "It's the least I can do after what you've done for me." Luke considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss McKenna. I believe I'll take you up on that offer." Luke dismounted again and led his horse toward the water trough near the barn. The animal was a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and the lean build of a horse accustomed to long distances. As Luke loosened the cinch and removed the saddle, Sarah watched the careful way he tended to his mount, checking hooves, running his hands along the horse's legs, speaking in low murmurs that seemed to calm the animal after the excitement with the bull. "Beautiful horse," Sarah said, approaching cautiously. She had always been good with animals, but strange horses could be unpredictable. "This here's Ranger," Luke said, giving the horse's neck a gentle pat. "Had him going on 6 years now. We've covered a fair piece of country together." Ranger turned his head toward Sarah and nickered softly, as if introducing himself. She held out her hand for him to sniff before stroking his velvety nose. "He's got good manners," she observed. "Better than some people I've met." Luke replied with a hint of humor in his voice. "Mind if I turn him out in your corral for the night? He's used to having room to move around." "Of course." Sarah unlatched the gate to the small enclosure adjacent to the barn. "There's hay in the lean-to if he needs it." As Luke led Ranger into the corral, Sarah found herself studying the man more closely. In the lamplight spilling from her kitchen window, she could see he was perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His clothes were well made but practical: a cotton shirt, leather vest, and denim trousers that had seen honest work. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength. "Mr. Carter," she said as he closed the corral gate, "you mentioned you were making a delivery to Cheyenne. What sort of freight do you carry?" "Mostly dry goods and supplies," he answered, wiping his hands on a cloth from his saddlebag. "Some medicines, tools, cloth, things folks in the smaller settlements can't get easy. I pick up orders in Denver and make the rounds to the towns and homesteads between there and Cheyenne. That must be dangerous work, traveling alone with valuable cargo." Luke shrugged. "Man learns to be careful. And most folks out here are honest enough, just trying to make their way same as anyone. The first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering against the dust with a sound like scattered pebbles. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky and made a decision that surprised her. "Mr. Carter, I was about to fix some supper. You're welcome to join me before you settle in the barn." Luke paused in the act of shouldering his saddlebags. "That's mighty generous, Miss McKenna. But I don't want to impose on your kindness any more than I already have." "You're not imposing," Sarah said firmly. "You saved my horse and quite possibly saved me from serious injury. The least I can do is offer you a proper meal." She saw him consider this, his gaze taking in the approaching storm and then settling on her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to reassure him, because he nodded slowly. "In that case, I'd be grateful for your hospitality." Sarah led the way to the house, suddenly conscious of how long it had been since she'd had a guest. The small cabin felt different with another person's presence filling the space. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but charged with an awareness she hadn't experienced in years. "You can set your things there by the door," she said, indicating a wooden bench her father had built. "There's a basin on the porch if you'd like to wash up," while Luke stepped outside to clean the dust and work from his hands. Sarah busied herself with supper preparations. She had planned on a simple meal of cornbread and the last of yesterday's stew, but with a guest, she felt compelled to do better. She added dumplings to stretch the stew and put coffee on to brew. The familiar routine of cooking helped settle her nerves, though she couldn't quite explain why she felt nervous in the first place. When Luke returned from washing, his hair was damp and combed back from his face. He had removed his hat and vest, and in the warm light of the oil lamps, he looked younger and somehow less formidable than he had outside dealing with the bull. "Smells wonderful in here," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Been a while since I've had a home-cooked meal." "Where do you call home, Mr. Carter?" Sarah asked as she stirred the stew. "Originally from Missouri," he replied, settling into the chair she indicated at the small table. "But I've been on the move for the better part of 5 years now. Haven't found a place that felt like staying put yet." There was something in his tone that suggested a story behind those words. But Sarah didn't press. She had learned that frontier life made people protective of their histories, and she respected that boundary. "This is good country for a man who likes to keep moving," she said instead. "Always somewhere new to see." "That it is." Luke accepted the bowl of stew she placed before him with a quiet thank you. "Though I imagine it gets lonely sometimes, especially for someone living out here alone." Sarah poured coffee for both of them and took her seat across the table. "I've got my work to keep me busy. The animals, the garden, maintaining the property. There's always something that needs doing." Luke took a careful spoonful of the stew, chewing thoughtfully before responding. "Your father taught you well. This place shows good care. He always said that taking care of what you have is the first step toward having more worth caring for." Sarah smiled at the memory. He had a saying for just about everything. Sounds like a wise man. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the increasing patter of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Sarah found herself watching the way Luke ate, deliberately, as if he had learned not to take meals for granted. He didn't wolf down his food like some men she had known, but neither did he dawdle. Everything about his manner suggested a man accustomed to being grateful for what he received. "This stew is excellent," he said after a few minutes. "You've got a gift for cooking." "Thank you, it's nothing fancy, but it's filling." Sarah felt pleased by the compliment, though she tried not to show it. What about you? Do you cook for yourself on the trail? Beans and hardtack mostly, Luke admitted with a slight smile. Coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, nothing that would tempt a discriminating palate. But you manage? A man learns to make do with what he has. Sarah sensed there was more to Luke Carter than the simple freighter he presented himself as. The way he spoke, the careful politeness, the competence with which he had handled the dangerous situation with the bull. All of it suggested education and experience beyond what a typical cargo hauler might possess. "Have you always been in the freight business?" she asked. Luke paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "No, ma'am. I've done various things over the years. Worked cattle for a while, tried my hand at mining, even taught school for a season down in Colorado Territory." "You were a teacher." Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. "Briefly." Luke's expression grew distant. "Found out I wasn't cut out for staying in one place that long. The children were good kids, but the town, well, let's just say it wasn't the right fit." Again, Sarah sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't probe. Instead, she refilled his coffee cup and asked, "What made you decide to take up freighting?" "Pays decent, and I like being on the road. Get to see new country, meet different folks. Every day's a little different from the last one. But don't you ever want to settle down? Have a place of your own?" Luke considered this while he broke off a piece of cornbread. "I reckon I've always figured I'd know the right place when I found it. Just haven't come across it yet." The way he said it made Sarah wonder if he was talking about more than just land. There was something in his tone, a kind of quiet searching that resonated with her own sense of incompleteness. "What about you?" Luke asked. "Ever think about leaving this place, trying life in one of the bigger towns?" Sarah shook her head firmly. "This is home. My father built this place from nothing, and my mother's buried on the hill behind the house. I can't imagine being anywhere else. That's something to be said for." Luke observed, "Having roots that deep." "Sometimes I think they're too deep," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "There are days when I wonder what it would be like to see something beyond these same hills and valleys. But you stay anyway. I stay anyway." They finished their meal as the storm intensified outside. Lightning began to flash more frequently, followed by the crack and rumble of thunder moving closer. Sarah rose to clear the dishes, but Luke stood as well. "Let me help with those," he said. "That's not necessary. My mother would tan my hide if she knew I let a lady clean up after feeding me without offering to help," Luke said with a grin that transformed his serious face. "Besides, I've been washing my own dishes for years. I know which end of a dish rag to use." Sarah found herself smiling back. "Well, if it's a matter of avoiding your mother's wrath, I suppose I can't refuse." They worked together at the basin, Luke washing while Sarah dried and put away. The simple domestic task felt strangely intimate in the quiet cabin, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed dishes back and forth. Sarah became acutely aware of Luke's presence beside her, the scent of soap and leather and something indefinably masculine, the careful way he handled her dishes as if they were made of the finest china rather than practical earthenware. "You've got a nice place here," Luke said as he handed her the last bowl. "Comfortable. Feels like a real home. Thank you." Sarah set the bowl in the cupboard and hung up the drying cloth. "It's not much, but it suits me." A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen windows, followed almost immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the house. Both of them looked toward the windows, where rain was now driving against the glass in sheets. "That's quite a storm," Luke observed. Wyoming weather can change fast. Sarah agreed, but it usually blows through quickly. Another flash lit up the night, and in the brief illumination, Sarah could see trees bending in the wind and rain falling so hard it seemed to bounce back up from the ground. I'm glad you're not trying to travel in this, she said. Me too. Luke moved away from the window and picked up his hat from the peg. I should let you get some rest. Thank you for the fine meal and the good company. Miss McKenna, it's been a pleasure. The pleasure was mine. Mr. Carter. Sarah felt a strange reluctance to see him go, even though he would only be out in the barn. I hope you'll be comfortable out there. I've slept in worse places, Luke assured her. Good night, ma'am. Good night. Sarah watched through the window as Luke made his way to the barn, his figure disappearing and reappearing in the flashes of lightning. Only when she saw the soft glow of a lantern appear in the barn did she turn away and begin preparing for bed. As she braided her hair and changed into her nightgown, Sarah found her thoughts returning to her unexpected guest. Luke Carter was unlike any man she had encountered before, polite without being obsequious, capable without being boastful, mysterious without being threatening. There was something about him that made her feel both safe and unsettled at the same time. She blew out the lamp and settled into bed, listening to the storm rage outside. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her walls, a stranger was sleeping in her barn, and for the first time in 3 years. Sarah McKenna didn't feel entirely alone. Sarah woke to the sound of steady hammering coming from somewhere outside. For a moment, she lay still in the gray pre-dawn light, disoriented by the unfamiliar noise. Then memory returned. Luke Carter, the storm, the invitation to shelter in her barn. She rose quickly and dressed, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency as she moved to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming in the early morning light. Puddles reflected the pale sky, and the air through her open window carried the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth. But what drew her attention was the sight of Luke working near the eastern fence line, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he drove a fence post into the ground. Sarah hurried through her morning routine, started coffee brewing, and stepped out onto the porch. Luke looked up from his work and touched his hat brim in greeting. Morning, Miss McKenna. Hope I didn't wake you. Wanted to get an early start on this fence before the day gets too warm. You didn't need to, Sarah began, but Luke was already shaking his head. Storm knocked down about 20 yards of your fence line, he said, gesturing toward the damaged section. That bull I mentioned yesterday? He'll be back if there's an easy way through. So will others. Sarah walked closer, surveying the damage. Several fence posts had been uprooted by the wind and driving rain, and the wire lay tangled on the ground like a metallic spider web. It would have taken her the better part of 2 days to repair it properly. Working alone. I was planning to take care of this myself, she said, though she felt more grateful than proud. I'm sure you were, Luke replied without any hint of condescension. But 2 people can get it done faster and better than one. Besides, I've got some experience with fence work. He had already reset 3 posts and was working on the 4th. Sarah noticed he had brought tools from his pack, a proper post hole digger, wire cutters, and a come-along for tensioning the wire. Professional tools that spoke of more than casual experience. What can I do to help? She asked. Luke paused in his digging and looked at her directly. You sure you don't mind the work? It's going to be dirty business, and this mud's going to be a challenge. Sarah almost smiled at the question. Mr. Carter, I've been doing dirty work since I was old enough to hold a pitchfork. I think I can manage a little mud. Fair enough. Luke handed her a pair of work gloves from his pack. These might be a bit big, but they'll save your hands. How about you start untangling that wire while I finish these posts? We'll need to know how much is salvageable. They worked in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher. The only sounds the thud of Luke's post-hole digger, the clink of Sarah sorting through tangled wire, and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring spread. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Luke as she worked. His movements were economical and sure, the result of long experience with this kind of labor. There was something satisfying about watching someone who truly knew their craft. "You've done a lot of fence work," she observed as Luke lifted a post into position. "More than I care to count," he admitted, tamping dirt around the base of the post. "Worked for a big ranch down in Colorado for a couple years. Must have strung 100 miles of fence during that time." "What made you leave ranch work for freighting?" Luke paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "The owner's son came back from college with ideas about how things should be run. Turned out his ideas and mine didn't agree much." There was something in his tone that suggested the disagreement had been significant, but Sarah didn't press for details. Instead, she held up a section of wire she had untangled. "This piece looks good. No breaks that I can see." "That's fine work," Luke said, examining the wire she had freed. "You've got a good eye for what's worth saving." The compliment warmed Sarah more than it should have. She had grown accustomed to working alone, to having no one notice or acknowledge her efforts. Luke's approval felt like a gift she hadn't realized she was hoping for. They worked steadily through the morning, falling into an easy rhythm. Luke would set and secure the posts while Sarah prepared the wire, checking for breaks and weak spots. When it came time to string the wire, they worked together, Luke tensioning it with the come-along while Sarah held it in place and secured it to the posts. "Pull it tight now," Luke instructed as he worked the lever on the come-along. "Fence wire's got to sing when you pluck it, or it won't hold when the cattle lean into it." Sarah felt the wire grow taut under her hands, thrumming with tension like a guitar string. "Like that? Perfect." Luke secured the wire to the final post and stepped back to survey their work. "That'll hold anything short of a stampede." Sarah looked at the repaired fence with satisfaction. What had seemed like an overwhelming task that morning was now complete, and done better than she could have managed alone. The new section looked strong and professional, blending seamlessly with the rest of the fence line. "Thank you," she said simply. "I couldn't have done this nearly as well by myself." "Might have taken you longer, but you'd have figured it out," Luke said, beginning to gather his tools. "You strike me as someone who finds a way to get things done." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah found herself noticing small details about Luke that she had missed the night before. The way he carried himself with quiet confidence, never hurried but always purposeful. The careful attention he paid to putting his tools away properly. The way he unconsciously checked on his horse in the corral as they passed, ensuring Ranger had water and wasn't favoring any of his legs. "Would you like some breakfast before you head to Cheyenne?" Sarah asked as they reached the porch. Luke hesitated, and Sarah could see him weighing politeness against his obvious desire to be on the road. "That's kind of you, but I should probably—" The rest of his words were cut off by a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Both of them looked up to see a massive bank of dark clouds building on the western horizon, their tops towering high into the morning sky. "That doesn't look friendly," Sarah observed. Luke studied the approaching weather with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the sky's moods. "No, it doesn't. And those clouds are moving faster than they look." Even as he spoke, Sarah could see the truth of his words. The wall of dark clouds was visibly advancing across the prairie, swallowing the blue sky as it came. The air had grown still and heavy, with that peculiar quality that often preceded violent weather. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "Maybe an hour, perhaps less." Luke looked toward his horse, then back at the approaching storm. "Might be wise to get Ranger into the barn and secure anything that might blow around." "Of course. And Mr. Carter?" Sarah caught his attention as he started toward the corral. "The offer of breakfast stands, storm or no storm. You might as well wait this one out in comfort." This time Luke didn't hesitate. "I'd be grateful for that. Miss McKenna." They worked quickly to prepare for the storm's arrival. Luke led Ranger into the barn and secured him in the stall next to Copper, while Sarah gathered in the washing she had hung out earlier and secured the shutters on her windows. The wind began to pick up, sending dust devils dancing across the yard and making the loose boards on the barn creak ominously. By the time they finished their preparations, the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall, and the western sky had turned an ominous green-black color that made Sarah's skin prickle with nervous energy. "Let's get inside," Luke said, his voice raised slightly to carry over the rising wind. They reached the safety of the house just as the storm broke in earnest. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, driven nearly horizontal by gusts of wind that rattled the windows and made the entire structure groan. Sarah busied herself with preparing breakfast while Luke stood at the window, watching the storm's fury with obvious concern. "Bacon and eggs suit you?" Sarah asked, raising her voice over the noise of the wind. "Sounds wonderful," Luke replied, though his attention remained focused on the weather outside. "This is turning into quite a blow." Sarah cracked eggs into her cast-iron skillet, the familiar sizzle and pop of cooking food providing a comforting counterpoint to the storm's violence. She had lived through enough prairie storms to know that this one, while fierce, would likely pass quickly. The truly dangerous ones announced themselves differently. "You seem worried," she observed as she turned the bacon. Luke moved away from the window and took a seat at the table. "Just habit, I suppose. When you're on the road as much as I am, weather can mean the difference between a good day and a very bad one." "But you're not on the road today," Sarah pointed out. "You're safe and dry, with a good breakfast coming and a sturdy roof over your head." A slow smile spread across Luke's features, transforming his serious expression. "You're right, of course. I guess I'm not used to having someone else worry about my welfare." "Well, today you do," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "At least until this storm passes." She served their breakfast as the wind howled around the house and rain drummed against the windows. Despite the chaos outside, the kitchen felt warm and peaceful, filled with the comfortable sounds of a shared meal and the soft crackle of the fire in the stove. "This is the best breakfast I've had in months," Luke said after his first few bites. "You're a fine cook, Miss McKenna." "Thank you. It's nice to have someone to cook for again." Sarah realized as she said it how true it was. Cooking for one had become a matter of mere necessity, but preparing a meal for someone else brought back the pleasure she had once found in the task. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" Luke asked quietly. Sarah considered the question as she cut her eggs. "Sometimes, especially in the evenings, when the work is done and there's nothing but silence. But during the day, with all the chores and responsibilities, there's hardly time to think about it. That's a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know," Sarah replied honestly. "And it's not all hard. There's satisfaction in taking care of yourself, in knowing you can handle whatever comes your way." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "I can understand that. There's something to be said for independence. Is that why you chose the traveling life?" For the independence? Partly. Luke pushed his eggs around on his plate, seeming to choose his words carefully. And partly because I never seemed to fit in one place for very long. Always felt like I was meant to be moving towards something, even if I wasn't sure what. And have you found it yet? Whatever you're moving toward? Luke looked up from his plate, meeting her eyes directly. For a moment, Sarah felt as if he was seeing her, really seeing her, in a way that made her breath catch slightly. I'm beginning to think maybe I have, he said quietly. Before Sarah could respond to that startling statement, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning. The storm was directly overhead now, its fury reaching a crescendo that made conversation impossible. They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, the intimacy of Luke's words hanging in the air between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. But something had shifted. Sarah realized some invisible barrier had been lowered, and she found herself looking at Luke Carter not just as a helpful stranger, but as a man whose presence in her kitchen felt surprisingly right. When the thunder finally began to fade and the rain gentled to a steady patter, Luke stood and moved to the window again. "Storm's moving on," he announced. "Should be clear enough to travel in another hour or so." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. The approaching end of the storm meant Luke would be leaving, continuing his journey to Cheyenne and whatever lay beyond. Their brief time together would become just a memory, a pleasant interlude in her solitary existence. "Your freight delivery is important?" she asked. "The people waiting for it think so," Luke replied. "Medical supplies mostly for the doctor in Cheyenne. Can't afford to delay that kind of cargo." "Of course not." Sarah began clearing the breakfast dishes, grateful for something to occupy her hands. "Will you be coming back this way?" Luke turned from the window, and she caught something in his expression that might have been hope. "My route takes me through here fairly regular, every few weeks or so, depending on what cargo I'm carrying." "Well then," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain casual, "you'll always be welcome to stop for a meal or shelter from the weather." "I'd like that," Luke said simply. "I'd like that very much." 3 days had passed since the storm, and Luke had not yet continued his journey to Cheyenne. Each morning brought a new reason to delay, a loose shoe on Ranger that needed attention, supplies to reorganize after the dampness from the storm, and then a wagon wheel on his freight cart that required repair. Sarah suspected these were excuses more than genuine necessities, and she found herself hoping she was right. Luke had taken to sleeping in the barn but taking his meals with her, an arrangement that felt natural despite its impropriety. They worked together on various tasks around the homestead, repairing a section of roof damaged by hail, reinforcing the chicken coop, and clearing debris from the storm. Sarah marveled at how much easier the work became with another pair of capable hands, and how much more pleasant it was to have someone to talk with during the long hours. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Sarah shaded her eyes against the morning sun and recognized the distinctive black paint and brass fittings of Ezekiel Daniels' buggy. Her heart sank slightly. Daniels was a neighboring rancher, a widower in his 50s who owned the largest spread in the county. He was also a man who had made his opinions about her unmarried state increasingly clear over the past year. Luke emerged from the barn where he had been tending to his horses, and Sarah saw his posture change subtly as he took in the approaching visitor. There was nothing defensive in his stance, but a watchful quality settled over him like a man accustomed to being judged by strangers. Daniels pulled his buggy to a stop in the yard and climbed down with the deliberate movements of a man who expected deference. He was a large man, thick through the middle but still powerful, with iron gray hair and the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself seriously. His clothes were well made and carefully maintained, the outfit of a successful man who wanted others to notice his success. "Morning, Sarah," Daniels said, touching his hat brim but keeping his eyes fixed on Luke. "Wasn't expecting to find you had company." "Good morning, Mr. Daniels," Sarah replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is Mr. Luke Carter. He's been helping me with some repairs after the storm. Mr. Carter, this is Ezekiel Daniels. He owns the Double D Ranch to the west." Luke stepped forward and extended his hand. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Daniels." Daniels shook Luke's hand, but Sarah could see him taking measure of the younger man, noting the calloused hands, the worn but quality clothes, the way Luke met his gaze directly without either challenge or submission. "Carter," Daniels repeated slowly. "Don't believe I know that name from around these parts. You from Wyoming Territory?" "No, sir," Luke replied evenly. "I'm a freighter, working the route between Denver and Cheyenne. Got caught in the storm a few nights back, and Miss McKenna was kind enough to offer shelter." "Freighter?" Daniel's tone suggested this was not a particularly impressive occupation. "That's dangerous work for a man traveling alone. Lot of road agents between here and Denver." "I've been fortunate so far," Luke said. There was no boasting in his voice, but no apology either. Sarah felt tension building in the air between the two men, though neither had said anything overtly hostile. It was the kind of careful verbal dancing that men engaged in when sizing each other up, each testing the other's boundaries and intentions. "Well," Daniel said, turning his attention back to Sarah, "I actually came by to check on you after that storm. Heard it was pretty fierce through this area. Wanted to make sure you hadn't suffered any damage." "That's very thoughtful of you," Sarah said, though she noticed he hadn't bothered to check on her after any of the previous storms that had passed through. "We lost some fence and had some roof damage, but nothing that couldn't be repaired." "We?" Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mr. Carter was kind enough to help with the repairs." "I see." Daniels looked around the yard, taking in the neat appearance of the property, the freshly repaired fence visible in the distance. "Must have been considerable help to get so much done so quickly." "Miss McKenna's a capable woman," Luke said quietly. "I just provided an extra pair of hands." "Oh, I'm sure Sarah's capable," Daniels agreed, but his tone carried an undercurrent that made Sarah uncomfortable. "Though it's a lot of work for a woman alone. Too much work, really." Sarah bristled at the implication. "I've been managing just fine, Mr. Daniels." "Of course you have," Daniels said smoothly. "But managing and thriving are two different things, aren't they? A woman in your position needs security, stability, someone to look after her interests." The subtext was clear enough to make Sarah's jaw tighten. Daniels had been circling this topic for months, making increasingly unsubtle hints about her need for male protection and his availability to provide it. The fact that he was doing so in front of Luke made it all the more irritating. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said carefully, "but I'm quite content with my current situation." "Are you?" Daniel's gaze flicked meaningfully toward Luke. "Because it seems to me you might be letting kindness cloud your judgment about the sorts of people you invite into your home." The words hung in the air like a slap. Sarah felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Luke spoke. "Mr. Daniels," Luke said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Miss McKenna offered shelter during a storm, and I accepted gratefully. I've tried to repay her kindness by helping with some needed repairs. I'm not sure what about that situation concerns you. Daniels turned to face Luke fully, and Sarah could see the older man's face darkening. What concerns me, Carter, is a stranger taking advantage of a woman's generous nature. Sarah's alone out here, without family to advise her or protect her from men who might see her. Vulnerability as an opportunity. Mr. Daniels, Sarah's voice was sharp with outrage. I hardly think... It's all right, Miss McKenna, Luke said quietly, never taking his eyes off Daniels. Mr. Daniels is just looking out for your welfare. That's the mark of a good neighbor. There was something in Luke's tone that suggested he understood exactly what kind of neighbor Daniels was trying to be. And Sarah saw the older man's face flush at the subtle challenge. I've known Sarah since she was a child, Daniels said, his voice rising slightly. I knew her father. God rest his soul, and I made him a promise before he died to keep an eye on her. That gives me certain responsibilities. Sarah stared at him in shock. My father never asked you to watch over me. Mr. Daniels. He would never have presumed to make such an arrangement without my knowledge. A man worries about his daughter's future, Daniels said, his tone becoming patronizing. Thomas knew you'd need guidance, someone to help you make proper decisions. A woman alone can't be expected to... To what? Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. To think for herself? To manage her own affairs? To choose her own company? Luke remained silent, but Sarah could feel his attention focused on the exchange with the intensity of a man prepared to act if necessary. There was something reassuring about his presence, even as she fought her own battle with Daniel's presumptions. Sarah, you're being emotional, Daniels said dismissively. You're not thinking clearly about the implications of harboring a drifter. What do you really know about this man? Where he's been? What he might have done? I know he helped me when I needed it, Sarah said firmly. I know he's worked honestly for everything he's given me in return. I know he treats me with respect and consideration. That's more than I can say for some people. The barb hit home, and Daniel's face darkened further. You're making a mistake, Sarah, a mistake your father would be ashamed to see. That was too much. Sarah stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. Don't you dare speak for my father, Ezekiel Daniel, and don't you dare come onto my property and tell me how to live my life. Your property? Daniels laughed harshly. This place is mortgaged to the hilt. You're one bad season away from losing everything Thomas built. You need someone with resources, someone established, someone who can provide real security. Someone like you, I suppose. Sarah's voice dripped with disdain. You could do worse, Daniel said bluntly. A lot worse. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sarah felt humiliated and furious, both at Daniel's presumption and at having this conversation in front of Luke. She was acutely aware of how the exchange must look to him, a woman being pressured by a neighbor who clearly saw her as property to be claimed. When Luke finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly in the still air. Mr. Daniels, I think you've said your piece. Maybe it's time you were heading home. Daniels whirled to face him. I don't recall asking for your opinion. Drifter. You didn't, Luke agreed mildly. But you asked it for anyway when you decided to have this conversation in front of me. Miss McKenna's made her feelings pretty clear. Seems like a gentleman would respect that. A gentleman? Daniel's voice was thick with scorn. What would a saddle tramp know about being a gentleman? Luke's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his hands settle at his sides in a way that suggested he was ready for whatever might come next. Enough to know when a lady's been insulted and needs defending. Defending? Daniels laughed again, but there was an ugly edge to it now. From what? An honest proposal? The offer of a secure future? From being told she doesn't know her own mind, Luke said simply. From being pressured into something she's clearly not interested in. From being treated like livestock at auction instead of a person with her own will. The words hit Daniels like physical blows, and Sarah saw his face go red with rage. For a moment, she thought he might actually strike Luke. But the younger man's calm readiness seemed to give him pause. "You're making an enemy you can't afford, Carter," Daniels said finally, his voice low and threatening. "I've got influence in this county. I can make things very difficult for a man in your line of work." "I appreciate the warning," Luke replied without apparent concern. "I'll keep it in mind." Daniels stared at him for a long moment, then turned back to Sarah. "You're making a mistake, Sarah. When this person moves on and leaves you with nothing but problems, don't come looking for help from me." "I wouldn't dream of it," Sarah said coldly. Daniels climbed back into his buggy with jerky, angry movements. "You'll regret this," he said as he gathered the reins. "Both of you." He drove away without another word, his buggy raising a cloud of dust that seemed to hang in the air long after he had disappeared over the hill. Sarah stood in the yard, her heart pounding with anger and embarrassment. She felt exposed and vulnerable, as if Daniels had stripped away some essential privacy. When she finally looked at Luke, she found him watching her with an expression of quiet sympathy. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have anything to apologize for," Luke said firmly. "That man was way out of line." "He's been persistent for months," Sarah admitted, "but never quite so direct. I think your presence made him feel he had to stake his claim more clearly." Luke's jaw tightened. "You're not property to be claimed." "No," Sarah agreed, feeling some of her strength return. "I'm not." They stood together in the morning sunlight, the ugliness of the encounter gradually fading as Sarah realized something important had happened. Luke had stood by her, had defended her right to make her own choices without taking over the fight entirely. He had treated her like a person capable of fighting her own battles while making it clear he would support her if needed. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of respect she had always hoped to find in a man but had begun to believe didn't exist. "Thank you," she said quietly. Luke nodded, understanding exactly what she was thanking him for. "Anytime, Miss McKenna. Anytime at all." The afternoon sky had been deceptively clear when Sarah and Luke finished securing the new gate posts for the corral. They had worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes between people who have begun to understand each other's rhythms. Luke would measure and mark while Sarah held the board steady, their movements coordinated without need for constant discussion. But now, as Sarah stepped back to admire their handiwork, she noticed the quality of light had changed. The sun, which had been bright and warm an hour ago, was now hidden behind a wall of clouds that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The air had grown heavy and still, with that peculiar charged feeling that made horses restless and chickens seek shelter. "We might be in for another blow," Luke said, following her gaze to the western horizon. His voice carried the casual tone of someone making an observation. But Sarah caught the underlying concern. Even as he spoke, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. So low it was felt as much as heard. Sarah's mare, Copper, lifted her head from grazing and snorted nervously, while Ranger moved closer to the barn, his ears pricked forward. "This one's moving fast," Sarah observed, watching the wall of dark clouds advance across the prairie with startling speed. Lightning flickered within the towering mass. Still too distant to hear the thunder, but close enough to make the air taste metallic. Luke was already moving toward the barn, Better get the animals secured. This doesn't look like a gentle rain. They worked quickly and efficiently, born of shared experience with prairie weather. Sarah led Copper into her stall while Luke brought Ranger in from the corral. The horses seemed grateful for the shelter, nickering softly to each other as if discussing the approaching storm. The chickens, Sarah began. Already taken care of, Luke said, latching Ranger's stall. Saw them heading for their coop about 10 minutes ago. Animals always know before we do. A gust of wind rattled the barn doors, and both of them looked up as the first fat raindrops began to patter against the roof. But this was different from the gentle storm they had weathered a few days ago. The wind carried an urgency that spoke of real violence to come. The house, Sarah said, suddenly thinking of her open windows and the laundry she had left on the line. They ran for the cabin as the storm broke in earnest. The wind hit them like a physical force, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet before Luke's steadying hand found her elbow. Rain began to fall in sheets, soaking them both in the few seconds it took to reach the porch. Inside, Sarah hurried to close shutters and secure anything that might blow around, while Luke moved to the windows, watching the storm's approach with the intensity of someone who had learned to read weather as a matter of survival. "This is a big one," he said over the rising howl of wind. "Might last a while." A tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by a brilliant flash of lightning that illuminated the kitchen windows like daylight. In that brief moment, Sarah could see trees bending nearly horizontal and rain falling so hard it seemed to bounce back up from the ground. "The roof," she said, hearing a new sound above the wind, a rhythmic tapping that suggested loose shingles. Luke was already moving toward the door. "I'll check the barn, make sure everything's secure." "You can't go out in this." Sarah caught his arm as another lightning bolt split the sky, followed instantly by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Have to," Luke said, though he didn't pull away from her touch. "If that roof goes, we'll lose the horses." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The thought of Luke out in this violence, climbing around on a wet roof in lightning and driving rain, terrified her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "Then I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "Sarah, don't argue with me," she interrupted, already reaching for her coat. "You'll need someone to hold the ladder steady, and I know this property better than you do in the dark." Luke looked as if he wanted to protest, but another gust of wind slammed into the house, followed by the sound of something, a shutter or piece of roof, tearing loose and clattering across the yard. "All right," he said, "but we stay together, and if I say we go back, we go back. No arguments." Sarah nodded, pulling on her heaviest coat and wrapping a scarf around her head. Luke checked his own coat and hat, then picked up the lantern from the kitchen table. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath and nodded. Luke opened the door, and they stepped out into the storm. The wind hit them like a wall, driving rain so hard it stung exposed skin. The lantern's light barely penetrated a few feet through the torrential downpour, but it was enough to show them the way to the barn. They fought their way across the yard, leaning into each other for support against the gusts that threatened to knock them down. The barn provided blessed relief from the wind, though the sound of rain on the roof was deafening. Both horses were agitated but unhurt, rolling their eyes at the storm's fury but trusting in the solid walls around them. "The leak's up there," Luke shouted over the noise, pointing to a corner where water was beginning to drip steadily onto the hay below. "Looks like some shingles came loose." Sarah followed his gaze and saw the problem. A section of the roof was letting in water, and if it got worse, it could damage their feed supply and make the barn unsuitable for the animals. "There's a ladder in the back," she called back, leading the way to where her father had stored tools and equipment. Together, they wrestled the heavy wooden ladder outside and positioned it against the barn wall. The wind made it nearly impossible to keep steady, and Sarah had to throw her full weight against the bottom rungs while Luke climbed, watching him disappear into the darkness above. Sarah felt her heart pounding with more than just exertion. Every flash of lightning revealed him balanced precariously on the wet roof, working to secure loose shingles while rain and wind did their best to tear him away from his perch. "How is it?" she shouted up at him during a brief lull in the wind. "Not too bad," came his voice from the darkness. "Just need to get these few shingles nailed down properly." A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and Sarah saw Luke working methodically despite the conditions. His movements careful but confident. He had obviously done this kind of emergency repair before, probably more times than he cared to remember. Another gust of wind shook the ladder, and Sarah gripped it tighter, her knuckles white with the effort of keeping it steady. She could feel the weight of Luke's movements above, every shift and adjustment transmitted through the wood to her hands. "Almost finished," he called down. But as he spoke, the storm seemed to redouble its efforts. A tremendous gust of wind caught the barn like a sail, and Sarah felt the ladder shift under her hands. She threw all her weight against it, her feet sliding on the wet ground as she fought to keep it in place. "Luke," she called in warning, just as another flash of lightning revealed him starting down the ladder. He was only halfway down when his foot slipped on a wet rung. Sarah watched in horror as he lost his balance, his hands scrambling for purchase on the slick wood. For a moment that seemed to last forever, he hung suspended between safety and a dangerous fall. Then his grip failed, and he fell the remaining distance, landing hard in the mud beside the barn with a grunt of pain and surprise. "Luke!" Sarah was beside him in an instant, the abandoned ladder forgotten as she knelt in the mud. "Are you hurt?" He sat up slowly, testing his limbs with the careful movements of someone checking for damage. Rain streamed down his face, and she could see him grimace as he moved his left shoulder. "Nothing broken," he said, though his voice was tight with discomfort. "Shoulder's a bit banged up, but I'll live." Sarah helped him to his feet, noting the way he favored his left side and the careful way he moved his arm. The storm was still raging around them, but her immediate concern was getting Luke inside where she could properly assess his condition. "Can you make it to the house?" she asked, having to shout over the wind. Luke nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him to straighten up. "Roof's secure," he said with a wry smile. "That's something anyway." They made their way back to the house, Luke leaning on Sarah more than he probably wanted to admit. By the time they reached the porch, both of them were soaked through and shivering, but the warmth of the kitchen felt like salvation. "Sit down," Sarah ordered, guiding Luke to a chair near the stove. "Let me get you some dry clothes and have a look at that shoulder." She bustled around the kitchen, stoking the fire and gathering towels and dry clothes from her father's trunk. When she turned back to Luke, she found him trying to remove his wet coat, his face pale with pain. "Here, let me help," she said, moving to his side. "I can manage," he protested, but his movements were awkward and obviously painful. "Don't be stubborn," Sarah said gently, helping him ease out of the wet coat. "You took that fall helping me. The least I can do is help you get comfortable." As she helped him remove his wet shirt, Sarah could see the angry bruise already forming on his shoulder and back where he had hit the ground. Her hands moved gently over the injured area, checking for broken bones or serious damage. "This is going to hurt for a few days," she said, noting the way he winced when she touched certain spots. "But I don't think anything's broken." You sound like you know what you're talking about, Luke said, his voice strained but carrying a hint of his usual humor. My father had his share of accidents around the place, Sarah explained, reaching for a bottle of liniment from her medicine box. I learned to patch him up when the doctor was too far away to fetch. She applied the liniment with gentle, efficient movements, noting the way Luke's muscles tensed under her touch. There was something intensely intimate about caring for him this way, about being trusted with his vulnerability. The storm raged outside, but here in the warm kitchen, they seemed to exist in their own small world. Better? She asked when she finished. Luke flexed his shoulder carefully, testing the range of motion. Much better. Thank you. Sarah became suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the way the lamplight played across his bare chest, of the scent of rain and soap and something indefinably masculine that was purely Luke. Her hands were still resting on his shoulders, and she could feel the warmth of his skin beneath her palms. Sarah, Luke said quietly, and something in his voice made her look up to meet his eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch. There was gratitude. Yes, but something else too. Something that made her heart race and her hands tremble where they touched him. They sat like that for a long moment. The storm forgotten. The world narrowed down to the space between them and the question hanging unspoken in the air. Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything forever. It was Luke who pulled back first, his expression careful and controlled. I should let you get some rest, he said, reaching for the dry shirt she had laid out for him. It's been a long day. Sarah felt a mixture of disappointment and relief as the moment passed. Part of her wanted to protest, to bridge the distance he had put between them, but the larger part recognized the wisdom of his restraint. Whatever was growing between them deserved more than a moment of storm-induced intimacy. Of course, she said, rising from her chair and busying herself with putting away the medical supplies. The storm should pass by morning. But as she prepared for bed that night, listening to the wind gradually die down outside, Sarah knew that something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance they had maintained was crumbling, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous, a connection that promised either great happiness or great heartbreak, and possibly both. The storm had passed 3 days ago, but its effects lingered in more ways than one. Luke's shoulder was healing well under Sarah's careful tending, though she noticed he still favored it when he thought she wasn't looking. More significant was the change in the atmosphere between them, a heightened awareness that made ordinary tasks feel charged with unspoken possibilities. They had fallen into an evening routine of sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains while they shared the comfortable silence of people who had learned to appreciate each other's company. Tonight was no different, except for the restless energy that seemed to pulse beneath the surface of their quiet conversation. Shoulder feeling better? Sarah asked, noting the way Luke rotated it experimentally as he settled into the chair beside her. Much better. Thanks to your doctoring, he replied with a smile that made her heart skip slightly. You've got gentle hands for such hard work. The compliment brought warmth to Sarah's cheeks, and she found herself looking down at her hands, suddenly conscious of their appearance. They were capable hands, strong from years of labor, but Luke's words made her aware of their feminine qualities in a way she rarely considered. My mother always said healing was about more than just medicine, she said quietly. She said it was about caring enough to want someone to get better. And do you? Luke asked, his voice softer than usual. Care enough, I mean? Sarah looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in his expression, vulnerability mixed with hope, that told her they were no longer talking about his injured shoulder. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." The admission hung between them like a bridge, waiting to be crossed. Luke leaned forward slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had been building for days. "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Both of them turned to see a rider approaching in the fading light, a young man on a tired horse, moving with the urgency of someone carrying important news. "Miss McKenna," the rider called as he drew near. "You Miss Sarah McKenna?" "I am," Sarah replied, standing and moving to the edge of the porch. Luke rose beside her, his hand instinctively moving to rest on her back in a gesture of support and protection. The rider was a boy of perhaps 16, dusty from hard travel and clearly excited about his errand. "I'm Billy Henderson, from town. Doc Patterson sent me to find you. There's gonna be a harvest dance next Saturday night at the church. He wanted to make sure you knew you were invited." Sarah felt a flutter of surprise. She had attended the harvest dance for several years running, but this was the first time anyone had made a special effort to ensure her invitation. "That's very kind of Dr. Patterson to think of me." "Well, ma'am," Billy said with a grin, "he mentioned specifically that if you had a gentleman friend visiting, he'd be welcome too." The boy's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Luke, and Sarah realized that news of Luke's presence had already spread through the small community. "Thank you for riding all this way to tell me," Sarah said, reaching into her pocket for a coin to give the boy for his trouble. "Much obliged, ma'am," Billy said, touching his hat. "Hope to see you both there. It's gonna be quite a celebration this year." After Billy rode away, Sarah and Luke returned to their chairs, but the easy atmosphere of earlier had been replaced by something more complex. The invitation had forced them to confront questions that had been simmering beneath the surface of their careful friendship. "A harvest dance," Sarah said, more to fill the silence than because the words needed saying. "Sounds like a nice tradition," Luke replied, though his tone was careful, neutral. Sarah twisted her hands in her lap, suddenly feeling awkward in a way she hadn't experienced since she was a girl. "I suppose, that is, if you're still here next Saturday, you might like to attend." The words came out more tentative than she had intended, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited for his response. It was one thing to share meals and work together on her isolated homestead. It was quite another to appear together at a community gathering where their association would be noted and discussed by everyone in the county. "Would you like me to escort you?" Luke asked directly, cutting through her uncertainty with characteristic honesty. Sarah paused, considering not just the question but what her answer would mean. "Yes, I would like that very much." Luke's smile was like sunrise, transforming his serious features with genuine pleasure. "Then I'd be honored to accompany you, Miss McKenna." The formality of his words was at odds with the warmth in his voice, and Sarah found herself smiling back, feeling lighter than she had in years. They sat together as full darkness settled over the prairie, each lost in their own thoughts about what the invitation might mean for their fragile relationship. It was Luke who finally broke the comfortable silence. "Sarah, what I was trying to say earlier." She turned to face him, noting the way the moonlight cast his features in silver and shadow. "Yes?" Luke stood abruptly and moved to lean against the porch railing, putting some distance between them as if he needed space to say what was on his mind. "I need you to know something about me. Something I should have told you before now." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. In her experience, Conversations that began this way rarely ended well. "What is it?" "I told you I left that ranch job in Colorado because of a disagreement with the owner's son," Luke said, his voice carefully controlled. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Sarah waited, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her was important enough to change everything between them. The owner's son was inappropriate with some of the women who worked in the house, Luke continued, his hands gripping the railing. Kitchen help, mostly young girls who couldn't afford to lose their positions and had no one to speak for them. Understanding began to dawn on Sarah, along with a growing sense of pride in the man standing before her. "I spoke to the owner about it," Luke went on. "When that didn't work, I confronted his son directly. Things got heated. I ended up leaving rather than making things worse for the women involved." "What happened to them?" Sarah asked quietly. "I made sure they all had letters of recommendation and enough money to find positions elsewhere before I left." Luke said, "It wasn't much, but it was what I could do." Sarah felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest. This was exactly the kind of man she had hoped Luke Carter might be. Someone who would stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves, even when it cost him personally. "That must have been difficult," she said. Luke turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his expression. "I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what kind of man I am. I don't walk away from fights when the cause is just, even when it would be easier to keep quiet. That's gotten me into trouble before, and it probably will again. And you're worried that I'll think less of you for it. I'm worried that you deserve better than a man who can't seem to settle anywhere for long, who carries the kind of reputation that makes respectable people nervous." Sarah stood and moved to join him at the railing, close enough to see the doubt in his eyes. "Luke Carter, if you think that story makes me think less of you, then you don't know me very well at all." Relief flickered across his features, but uncertainty remained. "There's more. Sarah, things about my past that might matter to someone thinking about getting involved with me." "Such as?" Luke was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him wrestling with how much to reveal. "I've never been married," he said finally. "But I came close once. A woman in Kansas. We were engaged. Had everything planned." Sarah felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but she kept her expression neutral. "What happened?" "She decided she couldn't marry a man who wouldn't stay in one place. She wanted security, stability, a husband who would be content to run a store or farm and never want to see what was over the next hill." Luke's smile was rueful. "She wasn't wrong to want those things. They just weren't things I could give her." "And now?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster. "Do you still want to see what's over the next hill?" Luke turned to face her fully, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "I'm beginning to think maybe I've been looking in the wrong direction," he said quietly. "Maybe what I was searching for was never over the next hill at all." They stood close together in the moonlight, the space between them charged with possibility. Sarah felt as if she was balanced on the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next words would determine whether she stepped forward into the unknown or retreated to the safety of solitude. "Luke," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have something to tell you too." He waited, giving her the same careful attention she had given him. "I've never been kissed," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her courage. "I'm 24 years old, and I've never been kissed by a man." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Sarah felt exposed, certain that Luke would see her confession as proof of her inexperience, her unsuitability for a man who had clearly lived more of life than she had. Instead, Luke's expression softened with something that looked like wonder. "Never?" Sarah shook her head, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. There were never many opportunities living out here, and the few men who showed interest, well, they weren't the kind of men I wanted to be kissed by. Luke stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scent of soap and leather that she had come to associate with safety and comfort. "And now?" he asked, echoing her earlier question. "Is there someone you'd want to be kissed by now?" Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. The honest answer would change everything between them, would cross a line they couldn't uncross. But looking into Luke's eyes, seeing the hope and tenderness there, she knew she was tired of being safe. "Yes," she whispered. Luke reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and cupped her face gently in his hands. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, and Sarah felt herself leaning into his touch. "Then we'll start slow," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "We'll take our time and do this right." Sarah closed her eyes, trusting him completely, and felt Luke's lips brush against hers in the gentlest possible kiss. It was barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent warmth spreading through her entire body. When she opened her eyes, Luke was watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. "Was that all right?" he asked. Sarah smiled, feeling as if something fundamental had shifted in her world. It was perfect. They stood together in the shadow of the barn, the moon casting silver light around them, and Sarah knew that whatever came next, this moment would be treasured forever. The moment when she stopped being afraid and chose to trust her heart to this good, honorable man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Sarah had been awake since before dawn, though she had tried to convince herself it was no different from any other day. The harvest dance was still hours away, but nervous energy coursed through her as she went about her morning chores. Luke had been unusually quiet over breakfast, though she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was anticipation there, certainly, but something else too. A careful attention that suggested he understood how significant this evening would be for both of them. "I should warn you," Sarah said as she cleared their breakfast dishes. "I'm not much of a dancer. We don't get many opportunities to practice such things out here." Luke's smile was gentle and reassuring. "I doubt that matters much. Something tells me you'll do just fine." By afternoon, Sarah found herself standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, trying to decide what to wear. Her wardrobe was practical rather than fashionable. Work dresses, a Sunday dress for church, and one dress that had been her mother's, carefully preserved in tissue paper and lavender sachets. The dress was a deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, with tiny pearl buttons down the front and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Sarah had worn it only once before, to her father's funeral, but somehow it felt right for tonight. Her mother had been beautiful in this dress, and wearing it made Sarah feel connected to something larger than her own nervousness. She braided her hair in a more elaborate style than usual, weaving in a blue ribbon that matched the dress. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the practical farm woman she had become, but someone softer, more feminine, someone worthy of being escorted to a dance by a man like Luke Carter. When she emerged from the house, Luke was waiting by the wagon he had hitched for the evening. He had clearly taken care with his own appearance, His best shirt was pressed and clean, his dark jacket brushed free of dust, and his hair was combed back with water. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made Sarah's breath catch. "Sarah," he said quietly, and the reverence in his voice made her feel beautiful in a way she had never experienced before. "You look different," she suggested, suddenly uncertain. "Perfect," he finished, offering his arm to help her up into the wagon. "Absolutely perfect." The drive to town took nearly an hour, but Sarah found herself wishing it would last longer. There was something magical about this time between afternoon and evening, when the world was painted in gold and amber light. Luke drove with easy competence, one hand on the reins while the other rested casually on the seat between them. Close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth of his presence. They talked easily about small things, the changing weather, the way the cottonwoods along the creek had turned yellow, the upcoming harvest. But underneath the ordinary conversation, Sarah was acutely aware of the unspoken significance of what they were doing. By appearing together at the dance, they would be making a statement to the entire community about their relationship, whatever that relationship might be. "Are you nervous?" Luke asked as they crested the hill that gave them their first view of town. Sarah considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I've been to any kind of social gathering, and never with... That is, I've never attended with an escort before." "Well," Luke said with a smile that eased some of her tension, "that makes two of us. I haven't escorted a lady to a dance in more years than I care to count." The church was at the center of town, its whitewashed walls and simple steeple a landmark visible for miles across the prairie. Tonight, warm light spilled from every window, and the sound of fiddle music drifted on the evening air. Wagons and buggies were lined up along the street, and Sarah could see people moving about in their finest clothes, the women's dresses bright spots of color in the gathering dusk. Luke helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation as they walked toward the church, Luke's hand resting lightly on her back in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. The church hall had been transformed for the evening. Tables lined the walls, laden with covered dishes contributed by the women of the community. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm pools of light over the assembled crowd. At one end of the room, a small group of musicians, two fiddle players, a man with a banjo, and an elderly woman at a pump organ, provided music for the dancers who had already begun to fill the center of the floor. Sarah's entrance with Luke caused something of a stir. Conversations paused as people noticed them, and she felt the weight of curious gazes. Some faces showed pleasant surprise, others speculation, and a few, particularly among the unmarried women, something that might have been disappointment. "Miss McKenna," Dr. Patterson approached them with a warm smile, his wife Martha at his side. "How wonderful that you could come. And Mr. Carter, isn't it? Welcome to our little celebration." Dr. Patterson was a slight man in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the gentle manner that made him beloved throughout the county. His wife was a plump, motherly woman who had made it her mission to look after the welfare of everyone in town. "Thank you for sending word about the dance," Sarah said, grateful for the warm welcome. "Dr. Patterson, Mrs. Patterson, this is Luke Carter. Luke, Dr. and Mrs. Patterson have been pillars of this community for more years than I can remember. Pleased to meet you both," Luke said, shaking hands with the doctor and touching his hat to Mrs. Patterson. "You have a beautiful town here." "Well, we like it," Dr. Patterson said with a chuckle. though I imagine it seems quiet to a man who travels as much as young Billy Henderson tells me you do." Before Luke could respond, a new voice interrupted their conversation. "Well, well, if it isn't our mysterious freighter." Sarah turned to see Ezekiel Daniels approaching, flanked by two other men she recognized as prominent ranchers from the area. Daniels was dressed in his finest clothes, a black suit with a silver watch chain across the vest, but his expression held none of the festive spirit of the evening. "Mr. Daniels," Luke said evenly, his posture shifting subtly to something more alert though still relaxed. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Oh, I wouldn't miss our harvest celebration," Daniels replied, his tone pleasant but his eyes cold. "It's always interesting to see who shows up to these community gatherings." The emphasis on community was slight but unmistakable, and Sarah felt her temper begin to rise. Before she could respond, however, Dr. Patterson stepped in with the smooth diplomacy of a man accustomed to managing difficult personalities. "Speaking of community," the doctor said cheerfully, "I don't believe you've met our guest, have you? Harold? Henry?" He turned to Daniel's companions. "Mr. Carter here has been helping Miss McKenna with some repairs after that last storm we had. Luke, these gentlemen are Harold Morrison and Henry Walsh, two of our most successful ranchers." The introductions were made with careful politeness, but Sarah could feel the undercurrents of tension. Morrison and Walsh seemed to be taking their cues from Daniels, and their assessment of Luke was clearly influenced by whatever Daniels had told them about the stranger in their midst. "Repairs, you say?" Morrison asked, a heavy-set man with a graying beard. "That's neighborly of you, Carter. Course, Miss McKenna's been managing on her own for some time now, quite successfully from what I hear." "Yes, she has," Luke agreed easily. "I was fortunate to be able to help when the storm hit. Miss McKenna's more than capable of handling anything that comes her way." The simple statement somehow diffused some of the tension in the group. Dr. Patterson beamed approvingly, while Mrs. Patterson nodded her agreement. Even Morrison seemed mollified by Luke's praise of Sarah's competence. But Daniels wasn't ready to let the matter drop. "Still," he said, "it's unusual for a woman alone to entertain overnight guests, especially strangers. People talk, you know." The comment landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger at Daniel's deliberate attempt to cast aspersions on her reputation. It was Mrs. Patterson who responded first, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had been the unofficial moral arbiter of the community for decades. "Ezekiel Daniels," she said sharply, "I'm surprised at you. Sarah McKenna is one of the finest young women in this county, and anyone who suggests otherwise had better have more than gossip to back up their words. As for Christian hospitality during a storm, I should hope any decent person would offer shelter to a fellow human being in need." "Of course, Martha," Daniels said quickly, clearly realizing he had overstepped. "I didn't mean to suggest anything improper. I was simply concerned for Sarah's reputation." "My reputation," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness, "is my own concern, Mr. Daniels, and I'll thank you not to discuss it as if I weren't standing right here." The rebuke was gentle but firm, and Sarah saw approval in Dr. Patterson's eyes and something that might have been admiration in Luke's. Daniel's face darkened, but before he could respond, the music changed to announce the beginning of the formal dancing. "Miss McKenna," Luke said, offering his arm with perfect timing, "would you honor me with this dance?" Sarah placed her hand on his arm, grateful for the escape he was providing. "I would be delighted, Mr. Carter." As they moved toward the dance floor, Sarah heard Mrs. Noor Patterson's voice behind them, crisp with displeasure. "Really, Ezekiel, what's gotten into you? That young man seems perfectly respectable to me, and Sarah certainly doesn't need you monitoring her social life." The opening dance was a waltz, and Sarah felt a moment of panic as she realized how long it had been since she had attempted anything more complex than the simple country dances of her childhood. But Luke's hand at her waist was steady and confident, and he guided her through the steps with such grace that she soon found herself following his lead without conscious thought. "You're a wonderful dancer," she said as they swept around the floor, her blue skirts swirling around them. "You're easy to lead," Luke replied, his eyes warm with pleasure. "And you were wrong about not being much of a dancer. You're graceful as anything." Sarah felt herself smiling with pure happiness as they moved together in perfect harmony. The music seemed to wrap around them, and for a few precious minutes, the rest of the world faded away. There was only Luke's strong arms guiding her, the warmth of his hand in hers, and the magical feeling of being completely in step with another person. When the waltz ended, they were approached by other couples, neighbors Sarah had known for years, eager to meet her mysterious escort. Luke was charming and polite with everyone, answering questions about his work and travels without revealing too much about himself. Sarah watched him navigate the social complexities with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, and felt a surge of pride in his ability to hold his own in any company. As the evening progressed, they danced again, a lively reel that had Sarah laughing with delight, and later a gentle schottische that allowed for quiet conversation. Between dances, they sampled the abundant food and spoke with other guests, gradually becoming part of the warm, inclusive atmosphere of the celebration. It was during a break in the music that an older man approached them, his weathered face familiar but his name just beyond Sarah's memory. "Miss McKenna," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "I'm not sure you remember me. Joshua Brennan. I knew your father well, bought horses from him several times over the years." "Of course, Mr. Brennan," Sarah said warmly, though the memory was vague. "How nice to see you again." Brennan's attention turned to Luke, and his expression grew thoughtful. "Mr. Carter, isn't it? I believe I heard you mention you worked the freight route between Denver and Cheyenne." "That's right," Luke confirmed. "Well, I'll be," Brennan said with a slow smile. "You wouldn't happen to be the same Luke Carter who helped out during that trouble with the claim jumpers down near Colorado Springs last spring?" Sarah felt Luke tense slightly beside her, and saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "That was a while back," Luke said carefully. "Indeed it was," Brennan agreed. "But folks don't forget that kind of help. You saved my nephew's farm, you know, and probably his life too. That gang would have killed him for certain if you hadn't stepped in when you did." Sarah looked at Luke with new eyes, seeing yet another layer of the man she was coming to know. Here was more evidence of his character, his willingness to help others, even when it put him at personal risk. "Your nephew exaggerated, I'm sure," Luke said uncomfortably. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "That's not how he tells it," Brennan said firmly. "According to him, you faced down 3 armed men with nothing but a rifle and nerves of steel. Then you stayed around to help him rebuild what they'd torn down before you continued on your way." Sarah felt her heart swell with pride and something deeper, a growing certainty that Luke Carter was exactly the kind of man she had always hoped existed, but had begun to believe she would never find. As the evening wound down and the last dance was announced, Luke led Sarah onto the floor one final time. The music was slow and sweet, and they moved together as if they had been dancing together for years instead of hours. "Thank you," Sarah said softly as they swayed to the gentle melody. "For what?" "For tonight. For bringing me here. For being—" She paused, searching for the right words. "For being someone I'm proud to be seen with." Luke's arms tightened around her slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Sarah, you're the one who should be thanked. I haven't felt like I belonged anywhere in a very long time. But tonight, dancing with you, meeting your neighbors, being part of this community, it feels like coming home." As the last notes of the music faded and the evening came to an end, Sarah knew that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer just two people who had found each other by accident. They were a couple, recognized as such by the community, and the possibilities that opened up were both thrilling and terrifying. The drive home was quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in thought about the evening and what it might mean for their future. When they reached the homestead, Luke helped her down from the wagon with the same careful courtesy he had shown all evening, but this time when his hands lingered at her waist. Sarah didn't step away. Instead, she looked up into his face, illuminated by moonlight and starlight, and saw her own hopes and uncertainties reflected there. "Luke," she said softly, "tonight was perfect." "It was," he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I hope it was just the beginning." The week following the harvest dance passed in a haze of quiet contentment mixed with nervous anticipation. Sarah found herself stealing glances at Luke as they worked together, remembering the feeling of dancing in his arms, the way he had looked at her when Joshua Brennan spoke of his heroic actions in Colorado Springs. But more than anything, she remembered the ride home in comfortable silence, and the way her heart had raced when he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. Something had shifted between them that night, an acknowledgement that they were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were choosing each other, deliberately and consciously, and the weight of that choice hung in the air like morning mist. Beautiful, but fragile. It was Thursday evening when Sarah made her decision. They had finished supper and were sitting on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the deepening sky. Luke was whittling a piece of wood, a habit she had noticed when his hands needed something to do while his mind worked through problems. The soft scrape of his knife against the wood was soothing, a counterpoint to the evening sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Luke," she said quietly, her voice barely disturbing the peaceful air between them. He looked up from his carving, and she could see his face clearly in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window. Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about not being able to settle in one place." Luke's hands stilled on his work, and she could see tension creep into his shoulders. "Sarah, let me finish," she said gently. "I've been thinking about it, and I realized something. I've never left this place. Not really. I've lived my whole life within a day's ride of where I was born. And lately, I've been wondering, what would it be like to see what's over the next hill?" Luke set down his carving and turned to face her fully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's—" She paused, searching for words to express something she was only beginning to understand. "Maybe it's being with someone who makes you feel like yourself. Only better." The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she waited for Luke's response, praying she hadn't overstepped some invisible boundary. Sarah, Luke said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Are you asking me to stay? I'm asking you to consider that maybe you don't have to choose between staying and going, she said, surprised by her own boldness. Maybe there's a third option. Luke studied her face in the dim light, and Sarah could see him working through the implications of what she was suggesting. You mean travel together? I mean... Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she pressed on. I mean that I'd like to sleep in the house tonight, in my room. And I'd like you to sleep in the house too, in your own room. Of course, she added quickly, but not in the barn anymore. The invitation hung between them, laden with significance that went far beyond the simple change of sleeping arrangements. It was an invitation into her private space, her sanctuary, a gesture of trust that acknowledged how much their relationship had deepened. Luke was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah began to worry that she had been too forward, too presumptuous. But when he spoke, his voice was warm with understanding and something that might have been relief. Are you sure? He asked. Once I cross that threshold, Sarah, everything changes. There's no going back to the way things were. I don't want to go back, Sarah said with quiet certainty. I want to go forward, slowly, carefully, but forward. Luke stood and moved to the porch railing, looking out over the moonlit prairie. Sarah watched him, noting the way his broad shoulders carried the weight of decision, the careful way he considered his words before speaking. I need you to understand something, he said without turning around. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. That scares me, because it means I have something to lose now. Something precious. Sarah rose and moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body but not quite touching. You're not the only one who's scared, she said softly. I've never cared about anyone the way I care about you either. But I've learned something these past weeks. What's that? That being scared isn't always a reason not to do something. Sometimes it's a sign that what you're doing matters. Luke turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight she could see something in his expression that made her breath catch. Wonder, tenderness, and something deeper that made her heart race. You're remarkable, he said quietly. Do you know that? You're the strongest, most generous person I've ever met, and you make me want to be better than I am. You don't need to be better, Sarah said, reaching out to touch his arm. You just need to be here, with me. Luke covered her hand with his own, his fingers warm and calloused from years of honest work. What if I can't give you the kind of life you deserve? What if we stop worrying about what might go wrong and focus on what feels right? Sarah interrupted gently. Right now, this moment, with you here beside me, this feels right. Luke was quiet for a moment, then smiled with an expression of such warmth that it transformed his entire face. You're right, he said. This does feel right. They stood together in comfortable silence, hands linked, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her, the kind of deep contentment that comes from making a decision that aligns with your heart's truest desires. So, Luke said eventually, separate rooms. Separate rooms, Sarah confirmed, though she couldn't help smiling at the careful way he said it. But in the same house, and we take our time. We take our time, Sarah agreed. We have all the time in the world. Luke squeezed her hand gently. I liked the sound of that. They prepared for bed with careful courtesy, Luke bringing his few belongings in from the barn while Sarah prepared the small room that had been her father's study for his use. She found extra blankets and a pillow, lit the oil lamp on the small table, and tried not to think too much about the significance of having a man, this man, sleeping under her roof, when they said goodnight outside their respective doorways. Luke leaned down and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "Sweet dreams, Sarah," he said softly. "Sweet dreams." Luke. Sarah lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the unfamiliar but comforting sounds of another person in her house, the creak of floorboards, the soft sound of Luke settling into bed, the different rhythm of breathing that told her she was no longer alone. It should have felt strange, perhaps even unsettling, but instead it felt like coming home to something she hadn't known she was missing. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying, and found Luke in her kitchen, fully dressed and making breakfast with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. "Morning," he said with a smile that made her heart skip. "Hope you don't mind me starting breakfast. I wanted to let you sleep in." "I don't mind at all," Sarah said, acutely aware of how domestic the scene was, how right it felt to start the day this way. "Thank you." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, talking easily about their plans for the day. There was no awkwardness, no sense that the previous night's conversation had created uncomfortable expectations. If anything, Sarah felt more relaxed than she had in weeks, as if some internal tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying had finally eased. After breakfast, they worked together to repair a section of the chicken coop that had been damaged in the last storm. It was simple work, but Sarah found herself treasuring these moments of partnership, the way Luke handed her nails before she asked for them, the way they moved around each other with increasing familiarity, the comfortable silences punctuated by easy conversation. "You know," Luke said as they secured the last board, "I've been thinking about what you said, about maybe not having to choose between staying and going." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. And I think you might be onto something. My freight route takes me through a lot of beautiful country, places you might like to see. You mean? I mean, maybe we could modify my route a little. Set up a base here, but take trips together. You could see Denver, Colorado Springs, some of the mining towns up in the mountains, and I could have a real home to come back to. Sarah felt excitement bubble up in her chest. That sounds wonderful. But what about the homestead? I can't just abandon it. We wouldn't have to, Luke said, warming to the idea. We could hire someone to look after things when we're away, or maybe take shorter trips during busy seasons and longer ones when the work is lighter. The possibility opened up before Sarah like a door to a larger world. She could see herself beside Luke on mountain trails, in bustling towns, experiencing all the things she had only dreamed about while still maintaining the home and land that meant so much to her. "You'd really want that?" she asked. "To base yourself here." Luke set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "Sarah, I'd want anything that meant being with you. This place, some other place, traveling together or staying put, none of that matters as much as the fact that we'd be together." The simple declaration hit Sarah with the force of absolute truth. This was what love felt like, she realized, not the desperate passion she had read about in novels, but this steady, sure knowledge that your life was better with this person in it, that you wanted to build something lasting together. "I love you," she said, the words coming out naturally, without fanfare or dramatic timing. "I love you. Luke Carter." Luke's face transformed with such joy that Sarah felt her own happiness reflected and magnified. "I love you too," he said, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make everything better just by being yourself. They stood together in the morning sunlight, hands joined, looking at each other with the wonder of people who had found something they hadn't dared hope for. There was no need for passionate declarations or dramatic gestures. This was better, quiet, certain, built on a foundation of respect and genuine affection that Sarah knew would last. "So what happens now?" she asked. Luke smiled, bringing her hands to his lips and kissing her knuckles gently. "Now we take our time. We learn each other's rhythms, figure out how to build a life together. We go slow and do this right." "How slow?" Sarah asked with a slight smile of her own. "As slow as you need," Luke said seriously. "Luke, we have the rest of our lives to figure this out. Sarah, there's no hurry." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Here was a man who understood that the best things in life were worth taking time for, worth building carefully and thoughtfully. She had found someone who valued her enough to wait, to let their relationship grow at its own pace rather than rushing toward some predetermined destination. As they walked back toward the house, Luke's arm around her shoulders and her hand resting trustingly on his chest, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had made the right choice. She didn't know exactly what their future would look like, but she knew it would be built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared work, and the kind of love that grew stronger with time rather than burning out in a blaze of passion. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and full of possibilities, and for the first time in her life, Sarah McKenna felt ready to explore them all, with the right person by her side, and all the time in the world to do it right.